The ground trembled beneath Petersburg, Virginia, on that fateful summer morning of July 30th, 1864. What followed would be remembered as one of the most innovative yet disastrous military operations of the American Civil War. A tale of ingenuity, poor leadership, and missed opportunity that would haunt the Union Army for generations to come. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the tunnel one final time. A former mining engineer from Pennsylvania, Pleasants had proposed what many considered impossible: dig a 500-foot tunnel beneath the Confederate lines, pack it with explosives, and blow a hole in the seemingly impenetrable Confederate defenses that had kept General Ulysses S. Grant's forces at bay for weeks. "The men have worked miracles," he whispered to himself as his lamp cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. His regiment of coal miners from the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry had labored in suffocating darkness for nearly a month, using only hand tools and incredible determination. Above ground, General Ambrose Burnside paced nervously. The man with the distinctive sideburns that would later bear his name had much to prove. After his catastrophic defeat at Fredericksburg 18 months earlier, this operation represented a chance at redemption. His elaborate plan for the attack following the explosion had been meticulous. Specially trained United States colored troops would lead the charge, navigating around the crater rather than through it, exploiting the gap in Confederate lines to capture Petersburg and potentially end the war. "This could change everything," Burnside told his officers during final preparations. "If we break through here, Richmond falls next, and with it, the Confederacy." Behind Confederate lines, General Robert E. Lee's forces had grown suspicious of the unusual silence from the Union lines. Confederate engineer officers had detected faint sounds of digging but couldn't pinpoint their origin. General Lee had ordered countermines dug, but none had intersected the Union tunnel. As dawn approached, on July 30th, Colonel Pleasants prepared to light the fuse. 4 tons of gunpowder, 8,000 pounds, had been packed into the gallery beneath a Confederate artillery battery, known as Elliott's Salient, manned by South Carolina troops under the command of Brigadier General Stephen Elliott. "Fire in the hole," Pleasants whispered, though no one could hear him deep in the earth as he lit the fuse and retreated through the tunnel. The Federal troops waited in tense silence in their trenches. The fuse was supposed to take 30 minutes to burn its length, detonating at precisely 3:30 in the morning. But 3:30 came and went. No explosion. 4 o'clock passed. Still nothing. According to first-hand accounts documented in the Petersburg campaign by Edwin C. Bearses, 2 brave volunteers, Sergeant Harry Reese and Lieutenant Jacob Doughty, entered the tunnel to investigate, discovering the fuse had gone out at a splice. They relit it and rushed back to safety. At 16 minutes past 4 on that summer morning, as the first hint of dawn painted the Virginia sky, the earth erupted with a force unlike anything witnessed in warfare before. A tremendous roar split the air as the ground beneath Elliott's Salient heaved upward in a massive explosion, throwing men, cannons, and earth high into the air. The Battle of the Crater had begun, and with it, one of the most tragic chapters in American military history was about to unfold. The explosion was apocalyptic. The ground beneath the Confederate position surged upward like a terrible wave, earth and debris climbing nearly 30 feet into the air before collapsing back upon itself, leaving a crater 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The force of the blast obliterated an entire Confederate regiment, the 18th and 22nd South Carolina Infantry, instantly killing more than 278 Southern soldiers. Union Corporal Edwin Brown of the 14th New York Heavy Artillery later wrote in his diary, "The earth trembled as though in the throes of a mighty earthquake. Then before our eyes a section of the rebel works lifted, seemed to hang suspended in the air for an instant, and burst into fragments that scattered in every direction. The spectacle was both terrible and magnificent." This account, preserved in the Library of Congress Civil War collection, captures the awesome power of what was, until that moment, the largest man-made explosion in history. For a precious 20 minutes following the blast, stunned silence reigned over the battlefield. Confederate survivors staggered away from the smoking crater in shock, while nearby Southern units scrambled to comprehend what had happened. This was the moment, the critical window of opportunity that General Burnside had counted on. But nothing happened. The specially trained division of United States colored troops, who had rehearsed for weeks to lead the assault, remained in reserve. At the last minute, General George Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, had overruled Burnside's plan, fearing political repercussions if black troops suffered heavy casualties. Instead, General James Ledley's 1st Division, unprepared and unrehearsed, was ordered to lead the attack. "Forward!" came the belated command as Union soldiers climbed from their trenches and advanced across the field toward the smoking crater. Brigadier General Ledley, whose reputation for heavy drinking was well known in the Army, was nowhere to be seen on the front lines. According to testimony later given to the Committee on the Conduct of the War, he had sought shelter in a bomb-proof dugout well behind the lines, drinking rum as his men advanced without proper leadership, as reported in the New York Tribune on August 5, 1864. The division moved forward with enthusiasm, but upon reaching the crater, confusion set in as officers seemed bewildered as to their next actions. The first waves of Union troops, instead of pushing forward around the crater as planned, descended into the massive pit itself. The soft, loose earth made movement difficult, and the steep sides of the crater proved challenging to scale on the far side. Men poured in by the hundreds, creating a bottleneck of blue uniforms in what was rapidly becoming a killing ground. Colonel William Fox of the 5th New York Heavy Artillery described the scene. It was like looking into the pit of hell itself. The sides were near vertical, composed of shattered earth, broken equipment, and in places the remains of Confederate soldiers. My men were sliding down into it rather than advancing around it as ordered. Confederate forces, recovering from their initial shock, began to organize a response. General William Mahone, a brilliant tactician, rushed reinforcements to the scene, positioning sharpshooters and artillery to fire directly into the crater, where Union forces were becoming increasingly concentrated and vulnerable. By 7 o'clock in the morning, what had begun as a potential breakthrough had transformed into a nightmarish trap. Thousands of Union soldiers were packed into the crater and nearby trenches, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and subjected to a growing storm of rifle fire and artillery that rained down from 3 sides. The disaster was unfolding just as the summer sun began to beat down upon the Virginia battlefield, adding the torment of heat and thirst to the already desperate situation. By mid-morning, the once promising Union assault had deteriorated into chaos. The crater, initially a symbol of Northern ingenuity, had become a death trap. As Confederate forces organized counterattacks from multiple directions, the Union soldiers found themselves in an untenable position, packed together so tightly that many couldn't even raise their rifles to fire. "It is a slaughter pen," wrote Lieutenant Freeman S. Boley of the 30th United States Colored Troops in his memoirs, later published in The Century magazine in 1890. "Men are unable to climb out of the steep sides under fire. Those who attempt to scale the far wall become easy targets, silhouetted against the sky." Despite Meade's last-minute decision, by 8:30 that morning, the black regiments of Brigadier General Edward Ferrero's 4th Division were finally ordered forward. The men advanced with discipline and determination, some making it farther than any previous units, momentarily breaching the Confederate lines beyond the crater before being forced back by intense fire. Private Louis Napoleon Nelson, of the 28th United States Colored Troops, recalled, "We moved forward knowing what awaited us, but every man was determined to prove our worth as soldiers. For many of us, this was our first real fight, our chance to strike a blow against the institution that had enslaved us and our families." When these black troops were eventually forced back to the crater, the fighting took on an even more savage character. Confederate troops, enraged by the presence of black soldiers on the battlefield, gave no quarter. Historical records from the official records of the War of the Rebellion document Confederate soldiers shouting, "Take no prisoners." As they closed in on the trapped Union forces, General Mahone, seeing the opportunity to deliver a crushing blow, ordered a direct counterattack at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Confederate soldiers from Alabama and Virginia regiments fixed bayonets and charged toward the crater. What followed was some of the most brutal hand-to-hand combat of the entire war. Captain John Chester White of the 12th Virginia Infantry described the scene in a letter home. "The fighting was as desperate as any I have witnessed in this war. The crater had become a cauldron of death, the bottom littered with bodies, the wounded crying out in agony beneath the feet of those still fighting." The racial dynamics of the battle added a terrible dimension to the carnage. As documented in the subsequent congressional investigation, black soldiers who attempted to surrender were often shot or bayoneted instead of being taken prisoner. Lieutenant Bowley witnessed Confederate soldiers bayoneting wounded black soldiers while shouting racial epithets. Inside the crater, the temperature rose to unbearable levels under the July sun. With no water and no shade, wounded men suffered terribly from thirst. The loose soil absorbed blood, creating a ghastly mud that coated everything and everyone. The air grew thick with gunpowder smoke, limiting visibility to just a few feet and adding to the confusion. General Burnside, watching the disaster unfold from his position behind the lines, desperately sought permission from Meade to withdraw his forces, but the request was initially denied. Meade still hoped that a breakthrough might be achieved if enough pressure was applied. By early afternoon, it was clear to everyone except the high command that the battle was lost. Union soldiers, trapped and with no hope of reinforcement or escape, began to surrender in large numbers. Others fought on desperately, knowing the fate that likely awaited the black soldiers if captured. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, General Burnside finally received permission to withdraw what remained of his forces. For many, it was already too late. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate counterattack had reclaimed most of the ground lost during the morning's confusion. Confederate General William Mahone's troops had systematically squeezed the Union forces back into the crater and surrounding trenches, where retreat became nearly impossible under the withering fire. "Withdraw if you can," the order finally reached. The front lines passed from officer to officer, often by runners who risked their lives crossing the exposed ground. For many Union soldiers, especially those in the deepest part of the crater, the command came as a cruel joke. There was nowhere to go, and no way to reach friendly lines without passing through a gauntlet of Confederate fire. According to the official report filed by Colonel Charles G. Loring of the 7th Massachusetts Infantry, the withdrawal became a scene of utter confusion. Men attempted to scramble up the steep sides of the crater, only to slide back down or be shot as they neared the rim. Those who managed to escape did so by running in small groups, zigzagging across open ground as bullets kicked up dust around their feet. As documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, an estimated 1,200 Union soldiers were captured during this final phase of the battle, many surrendering only when their ammunition was completely exhausted or when Confederate soldiers stood at the crater's edge, firing directly down into the pit. The fate of the United States colored troops was particularly harsh. As reported by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in 1865, colored soldiers were singled out for especially brutal treatment. Many were killed while attempting to surrender, while others were executed after being captured. The racial animosity that fueled this barbarity would later become a subject of significant controversy and investigation. Lieutenant George Arthur, of the 29th Connecticut Infantry, colored, wrote in his diary that evening, "I saw brave men shot down after they had thrown down their arms and raised their hands in surrender. The rebels seemed possessed by demons, shouting, 'No quarter for niggers,' as they bayoneted the wounded. It was not war, but murder." According to an article published in the Chicago Tribune on August 5, 1864, white Union officers commanding black troops faced similar brutality. Officers found leading Negro troops were subjected to particular hatred, with several executed alongside their men rather than being afforded the customary protections of rank. By 4:30 in the afternoon, what remained of the Union assault force had either been captured, killed, or had managed to retreat to Federal lines. The battle that had begun with such promise and innovation ended in one of the most lopsided Confederate victories of the late war period. General Ambrose Burnside, watching the final collapse of his grand plan, was reportedly overcome with emotion. His aide, Major William Cutting, later recounted. The general sat upon an ammunition box, head in hands, utterly destroyed by the day's events. He kept muttering, "My poor boys, my poor brave boys," over and over. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the cries of the wounded could still be heard coming from the crater and the surrounding no-man's land. Under informal truce, some wounded were recovered by stretcher parties working by lantern light, but many remained where they had fallen, suffering through the warm Virginia night until death brought release. The battle had lasted just 12 hours from explosion to final withdrawal, but its consequences would echo through the remainder of the war and beyond. The casualty figures from the Battle of the Crater told a devastating story. Union losses totaled 4,003 men, approximately 1,500 killed, wounded, or missing, and another 1,200 captured. Confederate casualties numbered around 1,500. The United States colored troops, despite entering the battle later than white units, suffered particularly heavy losses with nearly 40% of their committed forces becoming casualties. According to the Richmond Examiner issue of August 3, 1864, the field presented a spectacle of horror seldom witnessed even in this war. The crater itself resembled a mass grave more than a battlefield, with bodies so numerous that Confederate burial details were forced to work for 2 full days. The war correspondent for the New York Herald wrote on August 4th, "The failed assault at Petersburg ranks among the most costly mistakes of the war, not merely in lives lost, but in the squandering of an opportunity that might have shortened the conflict by months." In Washington, the political fallout was immediate and severe. Within days of the defeat, President Abraham Lincoln requested a full accounting of what had gone wrong. General Meade, eager to deflect blame, quickly convened a court of inquiry, appointing officers known to be unsympathetic to Burnside. The testimony gathered during these proceedings, preserved in the National Archives, reveals a desperate attempt by senior officers to avoid responsibility. General Burnside maintained that his original plan, having the trained United States colored troops lead the assault, would have succeeded. General Meade insisted that using untested black troops in such a pivotal role would have been irresponsible. General James Ledlie, whose absence from the battlefield while drinking in a bomb-proof shelter had contributed significantly to the confusion, offered implausible excuses for his behavior. His division had borne the brunt of the casualties in the early fighting, often advancing without proper leadership or clear objectives. According to testimony from Colonel Samuel Harriman, General Ledlie remained in the bomb-proof throughout the engagement, despite repeated messages informing him of the deteriorating situation at the front. When I found him, he appeared to be under the influence of spirits and incapable of issuing coherent orders. On August 1, 1864, just 2 days after the battle, General Ambrose Burnside was relieved of command. His military career, which had begun with such promise early in the war, was effectively over. He resigned his commission in April 1865, just days before the war's end. General Ledlie was also removed from command and would never again hold a significant military position. Several other officers were censured or transferred to less prestigious assignments. The Court of Inquiry ultimately placed the bulk of the blame on Burnside and his subordinates, largely exonerating Meade and Grant. For the black soldiers, who had participated in the battle, there was a bitter sense of having been denied the opportunity to prove their worth, only to be thrown into a hopeless situation and then blamed for its failure. Sergeant Major Thomas Morris of the 28th United States Colored Troops wrote in a letter published in the Christian Recorder, an African-American newspaper, "We were held back until the moment was lost, then pushed forward into the very jaws of death. And now they say we did not fight with courage. There is no justice in such accusations." Confederate General Lee, in his official report, credited the victory to the quick thinking of General Mahone and the courage of the Southern troops who counterattacked. But he also acknowledged that the initial Union plan had been sound, writing, "Had the enemy advanced promptly after the explosion, I believe they would have entered our lines." As summer faded into autumn, the siege of Petersburg continued. What might have been a decisive Union victory had instead become just another bloody chapter in a war that would drag on for another 9 months. The landscape around Petersburg still bore the physical scar of the Battle of the Crater long after the war ended. Unlike other battlefields that could be plowed under and returned to cultivation, the massive depression, nearly 30 feet deep, remained as a permanent reminder of that terrible July day. Today, preserved within the Petersburg National Battlefield, the crater continues to draw visitors who stand at its edge, trying to comprehend the horror that unfolded there. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the battle became a subject of controversy and finger-pointing. General Grant, in his memoirs published in 1885, was uncharacteristically blunt in his assessment. "It was the saddest affair I have witnessed in the war. Such opportunity for carrying fortifications I have never seen, and do not expect again to have." For the United States colored troops who participated in the battle, the crater represented a painful paradox. Despite their units performing admirably, under the most adverse circumstances, their contribution was initially diminished or ignored in official accounts, as documented by historian Joseph T. Glatthaar in Forged in Battle, the Civil War Alliance of Black Soldiers and White Officers. The USCT were denied the opportunity to lead the assault when success seemed possible, then blamed for its failure when thrown into an impossible situation. According to the Atlantic Monthly, in an 1878 retrospective, the conduct of the colored troops at the crater finally silenced many critics who had questioned the fighting qualities of Negro soldiers. That they advanced into a situation already deemed hopeless by their commanders and fought with remarkable determination speaks to their courage and commitment to the Union cause. The crater also became a focal point for ongoing debates about race and memory in America. In the decades following the Civil War, Confederate accounts of the battle frequently emphasized the participation of black troops as justification for the brutality that occurred during and after the fighting. These narratives, which became entrenched in lost cause mythology, portrayed the use of African American soldiers as a provocation that naturally led to a more violent Confederate response. Charles Reagan Wilson, in his landmark study, Baptized in Blood: The Religion of the Lost Cause, notes, Confederate veterans' accounts of the crater often focused on the outrage of facing black troops in battle, presenting their extreme violence as justified by this supposed transgression of racial boundaries. For the veterans who survived, the Battle of the Crater left lasting psychological wounds. Private Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who would later achieve fame at Gettysburg but was present at Petersburg, wrote in his post-war memoir, The Passing of the Armies, "There are some experiences that can never be fully communicated, some horrors that defy description. The crater at Petersburg is one such memory that many survivors chose never to speak of again." Military historians and tacticians continue to study the Battle of the Crater as a case study in how innovation without proper execution can lead to disaster. The brilliant engineering achievement of the mine was undone by poor leadership, last-minute changes to plans, and a failure to properly support the initial breakthrough. Colonel Theodore Lyman, a staff officer with the Army of the Potomac, perhaps, summed it up best in a letter written on August 2, 1864. Thus was lost a great opportunity of taking Petersburg and shortening the war, through the incompetency of commanders and the folly of the government in persisting in the advancement of political generals. As the nation struggled to heal in the decades following the Civil War, the crater served as a metaphor for the conflict itself, an enormous wound in the landscape that, like the divisions in American society, would take generations to heal. The battle's legacy lives on, a testament to both human ingenuity and the terrible cost of war. Today, visitors walking the ground at Petersburg National Battlefield can still see the depression where the earth erupted on that July morning. A permanent reminder of what one Park Service historian called a brilliant concept undone by human frailty, a microcosm of the war itself.